From February until September of 1988, Saddam Hussein launched what would become known as the Anfal campaigns against the Kurdish people of northern Iraq. Rebel Kurds had sought to obtain independence, but were brutally put down by the Iraqi military. Men of fighting age were executed, and women and children were detained in concentration camps. Chemical weapons were also widely used against civilian populations, leading many to describe the campaigns as a genocide of the Kurdish people. It is perhaps helpful to start with the situation in 1988 and the Iran-Iraq War. The war with Iran and Iraq led to hundreds of thousands of troops from both sides being killed in the most brutal of fighting. Mass bayonet charges, child soldiers running through minefields, and the use of chemical weapons. This made for one of the most disturbing wars of the 20th century, but this war ultimately led to a stalemate. During the war, Kurdish fighters of the Peshmerga had assisted Iranian forces in capturing Iraqi cities. One notable example was the attempted capture of the Hajj Omran in the year 1983. This led to 8,000 Kurdish fighters rounded up and summarily executed. This attack was also noted for the first use of chemical weapons by the Iraqis on Iranian and Kurdish forces. The Kurds of northern Iraq had long fought for their own independent state, but under Saddam Hussein's pan-Arab unification goals, the Kurds would have no place, and persecution only increased. To this day, the Kurds remain the largest ethnic group without a state of their own. The Kurds of northern Iraq organized into political parties. These were the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, otherwise known as the PUK, and the Kurdistan Democratic Party, or the KDP. Despite their political differences, both fought for a separate Kurdish state. Now, the topic of this video is the Anfal campaigns. However, before the campaigns, the Iraqi government had committed heinous acts on the Kurdish people. In April of 1987, planes carrying chemical weapons attacked the village of Balisan, leaving the civilians severely injured. Many were blinded, yellow discharge flooding from their eyes. Many vomited as their faces turned black. Some died from the exposure to the chemical. This attack marked the first time a government deployed chemical weapons on its own people. This, however, would not be the last time. Following the chemical attack, intelligence officers raided the hospitals where survivors were being treated, abducting some of the patients. Busloads of boys and men were driven away, never to be seen again. Numerous villages were wiped out in 1987, as many as 700 destroyed. Tens of thousands of Kurds were resettled into central Iraq, attempting to cut off civilian support for the Peshmerga fighters. The Iraqi military was in a position to once and for all put an end to Kurdish revolts. It was to be led by Saddam's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, a man who would earn the nickname Chemical Ali for his widespread use of such weapons. Ali was given special powers to oversee the pacification of the Kurdish insurgency, but his goal was a final solution to the Kurdish question. This began with the stripping of property rights from Kurds in April of 1987, and soon enough, family members of Kurdish saboteurs were to be executed. And then in May, it was ordered that any wounded civilians should be summarily executed. Vast swathes of Kurdish-controlled land were deemed as prohibited, making those who remained automatically classed as saboteurs. In June of 1987, it was ordered that the Kurds in the north be denied food, with farming and cattle rights withdrawn and food shipments prohibited in certain Kurdish areas. Ali is quoted as stating his hatred for the Kurdish people in quite explicit terms. For example, he stated, "Why should I continue to let them live like donkeys, who don't know anything, and to take care of them? No, I will bury them with bulldozers." There were, however, some Kurdish paramilitaries who aligned with the Iraqi state. These were known as the Jaish. Often, the Jaish would reveal to the Iraqi military the location of hidden Kurdish villages that did not show up on any maps. The term Jaish is a derogatory term for a traitor or collaborator. The first Anfal campaign began with an assault on the PUK headquarters in the Jafati Valley. The Peshmerga had gas masks and training in chemical weapons defense. As for the civilians, all they had was wet clothing for protection. The Jafati Valley was as vital to the Kurdish as Baghdad was to the Iraqi government, meaning that defeating the Kurds here would have a dramatic effect on morale and organization. On the 23rd of February 1988, the Iraqi army launched an attack on both the PUK headquarters and the villages of the Jafati Valley. A massive attack was launched with both ground forces and aircraft. Chemical weapons targeted both the Peshmerga and the civilians. Homes were bulldozed, yet many civilians managed to flee to Iran, but tragically not all of them would make it. Many who attempted died in the snowy mountains, succumbing to exposure. On the 16th of March, one of the more notorious attacks of the Anfal campaign took place against the town of Halabja. The population of this town had increased from 40 to 60,000 due to refugees seeking shelter from the brutal war. The Iraqi military launched a massive airstrike and artillery bombardment of the town. Continuous strikes rained down without relent. Chemical bombs were dropped not only on the abandoned military bases, but on civilian areas too. People trapped in their houses began to smell the chemicals seeping in. The civilians were then faced with the option of remaining trapped inside or attempting to flee. Those who left their homes were greeted with the dead and dying in the streets. Those affected burst into fits of ominous laughter before succumbing to the gas. Many managed to escape to Iran, where the sickest received treatment, but plenty died from the chemical attacks. At least 3,200 were killed, the town was bulldozed and infrastructure blown up. The methods employed in Halabja would provide the template for the following Anfal attacks against the Kurds. Chemical weapons, the bulldozing of homes, but with the addition of rounding up and detaining civilians. The second Anfal saw the attacks against the region of Karadag. On the 22nd of March, a village was shelled with chemical weapons. Villagers noticed the distinct smell of apples. According to one witness, who would later bury 67 people, said they all had blood running from their noses, as if their brains had exploded. As the villagers attempted to flee, they were chased and corralled by the Iraqi army and the Jaish militias. Men and boys over 14 were arrested and taken away, never to be seen again, their fate likely being buried in a mass grave. Thousands were arrested and taken to military bases. They received little food, faced interrogation, and lived in squalid conditions. Those who managed to escape detention fled to the Garman region, which would be the setting for the third Anfal. During the third Anfal, chemical weapons were used more sparingly, yet many more were arrested. Iraqi and Jaish forces swept through, destroying villages and arresting civilians. Homes were set ablaze, and livestock was slaughtered. From each village, dozens of men and boys were loaded into trucks, and just like before, they were never seen again. Small units of Peshmerga fighters proved no match for helicopter, planes, and heavy weapons brought by the Iraqi military. Jaish militias would encourage the villagers to surrender, promising amnesty, shelter, and safety. But often, this would be a ruse. One witness to this was Aisha, who was heavily pregnant when her village was attacked. She fled and was advised by a Jaish commander to surrender to the Iraqi military. Instead, she fled with others to a nearby cave, where she gave birth. Whilst attempting to find food, she encountered the same commander, who again encouraged her to seek shelter in a nearby school. The Iraqi military soon arrived. They dismissed the Jaish militia and separated the men from the women. The men were taken away and never seen again. Aisha lost her husband, 3 brothers, and 12 other family members to the Iraqi military that day. By the 4th Anfal, the Peshmerga realized that they could not stand up to the Iraqi army, and they organized a retreat, with aims to protect the fleeing civilians. In another Kurdish area on the 3rd of May, a group of MiGs dropped chemical weapons. At least 154 were killed in the strike. One of the dead was found nursing her infant child. Others were found dead in the fields tending to crops. Many attempted to escape, but in order to stop this, the Iraqi government opened a nearby dam in order to flood the river, making crossing it impossible. In addition, the cable ferry was destroyed by the Iraqi military, meaning they were able to arrest hundreds of people. One survivor of the fourth Anfal was Spadia. Her village had been given 2 months to evacuate, but after a week, this was reduced to a mere 24 hours. Helicopters, artillery, and ground troops destroyed her village, and when looking for escape, she spotted Iraqi troops in the mountains waiting to capture those who sought refuge in the caves. Every village they fled to had been destroyed. Her 2 brothers were Peshmerga fighters who assisted civilians in crossing a flooded river. She would later learn that her brothers were last seen captured and loaded into the back of a truck. She would never see her 2 brothers ever again. The 5th, 6th, and 7th Anfals would take place between May and August. The Iraqi military was eager to expel the remaining Iranian troops and to punish the Kurds. But in the Korak Mountains, the PUK and Peshmerga forces mounted a solid defense. There was news that Iran was seeking to end their war with Iraq. This news began to worry the Kurds, who attempted to continue to retreat to Iran. The chemical attacks were ongoing, and civilians continued to be rounded up. The civilian men were promised amnesty under 2 conditions. They hand in their weapons, and they sign a confession that they were Peshmerga. Though this again was a ruse, and the men who confessed disappeared. The 8th Anfal soon began, which was directed at the KDP, but this time the Iran-Iraq war was finally over. This meant that more Iraqi troops were freed to take part in the Anfal. Morale amongst the Iraqis was high, as the end of the war was seen as a victory for them. In the Zagros Mountains, the KDP's 6,000 fighters were ready, but against 200,000 Iraqi troops, artillery and air force, they would not be able to stop the onslaught. Cluster bombs and artillery preceded the ground invasion. The KDP headquarters was the first target for chemical weapons. Civilians attempted to flee into nearby Turkey, but in a repeat of previous Anfal campaigns, they were detained. Many of the detained would end up in the Tapauza prison camp. An estimated 11,500 men, women and children ended up at the camp for processing. Upon arrival, men and women were separated. Boys and men aged between 12 and 50 were the key targets, those deemed of military age. They were fed starvation rations of oily broth and stale bread if they were lucky. The men were often denied food altogether. There was nothing in the way of sanitation. Prisoners forced to defecate in tins. Throughout their imprisonment, children and infants would be arbitrarily taken from their mothers for hours at a time, with their cries still audible. For the elderly, as many as 8,000 were dumped into an abandoned prison, and they were left to starve. The fate for the men taken away would be an arduous journey aboard a military truck. For as long as 10 hours in the blistering heat, prisoners were transported in a truck. The trucks were then handed over to members of the Iraqi secret police and the Ba'ath Party. The trucks would then be driven to pre-dug graves, where bulldozers awaited. The prisoners were tied together and then dragged to the pits, where they would then be executed. On the 6th of September, women and children in detention were given an amnesty. This was not extended to the men. The role of the Jaish is also a complicated matter. Some commanders insisted they were never told where the captives were being sent, let alone that they were being executed. However, when the men and women were being separated, plenty of the Jaish realized what was happening, at least according to some of the survivors. Some witnesses point to the Jaish being used by the Iraqi military and then disregarded. They were clearly seen as the bottom rung of the operation, with leading and influential Jaish commanders threatened with execution for querying whether amnesty was ever on the table for the Kurds. Being a member of the Jaish did not guarantee your family would not be killed, nor your village razed. Some Jaish would take bribes to protect their fellow Kurds, whilst others lied to the Iraqi officers to protect women and children. Some even assisted women and children escape captivity. Nevertheless, the role they played in the Anfal campaign cannot be understated. In the end, an estimated 50,000 people were murdered during the Anfal campaign. It was not just Kurds who were killed, as the Ba'ath Party sought to class non-Arab Christians as loyalists or Kurds. Even after the campaigns ended, the survivors were not in a position to rebuild their homes, farms, or infrastructure. Possessions had been looted, and pipes that carried water were ripped from the ground, with over 4,000 villages destroyed. Chemical Ali had his special powers withdrawn in April of 1989. He remained Saddam's enforcer, though during the Iraq War he was captured by American Special Forces. Ali was hanged on the 25th of January 2010. He received 8 death sentences for his role in the Anfal campaign and genocide of the Kurdish people. There is a question as to whether the Anfal campaigns was politicide or genocide. It could be argued that the Iraqi government had legitimate counterinsurgency goals in dealing with the Iranian-backed Kurdish militias. However, the horrors of the Anfal campaigns, from the use of chemical weapons to the destruction of many Kurdish villages, it is one of the more disturbing events in history. As of right now, the Kurds remain the largest ethnic group without a homeland or a national state. Many Kurdish political parties are designated as terrorist groups, as their fight escalates and continues.